In this film, I want to share with you some unknown stories about visiting Georgia by Saturn world rulers. Heads of such states as Russia, India, Cuba, Great Britain and the USA are heroes of this film. In June 1955, Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, and his daughter Indira Gandhi set their feet on the Georgian land.
Jawaharlal Nehru and his daughter Indira Gandhi moved in the open automobile from the airport to the center of Tbilisi. 100,000 people poured out in the streets and welcomed the motorcade along the whole road of movement. The Indian delegation visited metallurgic plant in Rustavi. Later Nehru will build a similar plant in his country. Besides, the guests from India visited the Romi Viticulture State Farm. In June 1976, or 21 years later, Indira Gandhi as a Prime Minister of India again visited Tbilisi. Representatives of the Georgia authorities and cultural workers met the honored guest and gave her bunches of flowers. The Indian Prime Minister was shown the sights in Tbilisi. Edward Shevardnadze, head of the Georgia state of that period, accompanied the high guest at the drive in Tbilisi. They stopped at the building of Concert Hall of Tbilisi Philharmonic Society. Indira Gandhi and her companions were invited to the rehearsal of children's amateur art group. The guest was very impressed with performance of young Georgian artists. Indira Gandhi walked up the stage, warmly thanked the children for their performance and took a souvenir photo.
In May 1961, the head of Soviet state, Nikita Khrushchev, arrived in the capital of Georgia.
The leader of the USSR arrived in Tbilisi railway station by the train from Yerevan. The Soviet leader of the ruling party was driven in Tbilisi streets in the open car. Many Tbilisi residents stood in crowds not only in the pavements but in the balconies of the houses too. Nikita Khrushchev visited the exhibition of achievements of people's economy. He highly appreciated Georgian tea and said that its quality was the best one in the world. Nikita Khrushchev advised the Georgian viticulturists to cultivate maize. Nikita Khrushchev said, "I know that the Georgian people like romi, a delicious dish made of maize. It is especially good with Georgian seasonings. I have joked before that one can eat even nails with the Georgian seasonings kemali." In June 1963, Nikita Khrushchev visited Georgia again. This time he was accompanied by the Cuban leader Fidel Castro. The guests were invited to visit one of Kakheti villages. While proposing a toast, Khrushchev addressed Castro. "You see, Fidel, we are only building socialism in our countries, while here in Georgia it has been already built."
The next USSR leader, Leonid Brezhnev, visited Georgia 4 times during 18 years of his governing.
At movement of the head of the Soviet Union, personnel of the law enforcement bodies were as a rule brought into a state of readiness number 1. After the motorcade passed through a certain part, command cancellation was usually given. When the motorcade of Leonid Brezhnev passed through the central square of Tbilisi, command cancellation was given as usual after the state of readiness. Unexpectedly, the state of readiness number 1 was again announced in a minute. As it became known later, a curious incident was the reason of it. As it turned out, Leonid Brezhnev left his hat at the governmental country cottage, and by that reason a car was led out from the motorcade and sent back across the central square for delivery of the head of the Kremlin boss. A solemn dinner was arranged at the restaurant of Tatsminda Mountain. During the banquet, Leonid Brezhnev absent-mindedly looked around him. He neither ate nor drank something. Suddenly, Leonid Brezhnev gave a wink to the journalists who accompanied him in the trip and said, "What will you say, Eagles? Should we drink for Georgia?" An assistant of Leonid Brezhnev, who stood by his side, half rose at that moment. He could only say, "But Leonid Ilyich, dear, you know, doctors have categorically prohibited you. You and your doctors," Leonid Brezhnev answered, using bad language. "Pour the white one," the Secretary General declared. "I must have a drink with the literally fraternity." Leonid Brezhnev said about Georgia, "Everybody in our country knows that Georgia is a beautiful part of the earth. People with open hearts live here. They have always appreciated human nobility and loyalty in friendship."
Margaret Thatcher, the British Premier, visited Tbilisi in April 1987.
The British Premier was given a present in Tbilisi, Georgian national dress and shoes. The high guest walked in old Tbilisi wearing the Georgian national costume. Margaret Thatcher visited the Georgian Art Museum. Young dancers offered a short 15-minute performance to Margaret Thatcher in the Palace of Solemn Rituals. Margaret Thatcher could sit on the chair, but she didn't. With her eyes wide open, she acclaimed to the young dancers during all the 15 minutes. Margaret Thatcher was invited to the solemn supper in restaurant Tbilisi. The table was full of various Georgian dishes. Thatcher tasted all of them. She liked the light drinks very much. Margaret Thatcher proposed a toast at the reception. She said in particular, "You Georgians are evidently the most ancient people among the residents of all Soviet republics, and your culture is famous worldwide." Margaret Thatcher noted that the famous Georgian poem of the 12th century, "The Knight in Tiger Skin," was written about 200 years before the English writer Geoffrey Chaucer published his works. Margaret Thatcher declared that the both countries had the traditions that they were proud of. She added that the peoples of these two countries were very fond of tea, and the Georgians and the Englishmen even had one common principal patron saint, Saint George.
The next story refers to visiting Georgia of Boris Yeltsin, the Russian president. He arrived in Tbilisi in February 1994.
Unprecedented security measures were taken prior to arrival of Yeltsin. Russian special missions units armed even with grenade launchers were on duty near the places where the rank talks were held. On 3rd February, personnel of the Ministry of Interior Affairs and the Ministry of State Security of Georgia spent the whole day in Tbilisi streets. Initially, the visit was scheduled as a two-day one, but the Russian president had to reduce the term to 1 day because of deficit of time. However, the whole program was managed to be fulfilled. Not only the talks were held, an agreement was signed, and a press conference was held, but the guests managed to visit Patriarch Ilyas II and the Academy of Sciences. Prior to departure, Boris Yeltsin and his retinue were invited to the restaurant at Metehi Palace Hotel. The delegation was very dignified. About 100 guests were gathered at the table full of Georgian national dishes, wines and cognacs. The table was served with fried pigs, tsitsivi, khinkali, kupati and khachapuri. Eduard Shevardnadze was the tamado on that day. The president of Georgia declared that the visit of Boris Yeltsin to Georgia was one of the most significant events in the country during the last 200 years. After the party at the restaurant was over, Boris Yeltsin and his retinue left for the airport and then for Moscow. The visit took place on the 3rd February 1994. Since the day, undercarriage of the Russian presidential aircraft never touched the concrete runway of Tbilisi airport.
In May 2005, George Bush, the President of the USA, arrived in Tbilisi.
The US President was accompanied with about 700-member retinue. Prior to landing of the aircraft with George Bush on board, a special aircraft landed in Tbilisi. Cars of the motorcade of the head of the USA as well as the relevant equipment were delivered by the special aircraft. Air area of Georgia was closed and it was under control of special aircrafts and military helicopters. Roads from the airport to Tbilisi were blocked for motor transport. The presidential motorcade arrived first in the historic Tbilisi district, Avadatubani, known as the district of Tbilisi sulfuric bath houses. Georgian artists performed national dances at the improvised stages while a choir sang from the balcony. Many colored salutes illuminated the sky. The first couple of Georgia invited George Bush and his wife to a supper at the restaurant. The table was served with Georgian dishes. George Bush liked khinkali most of all. After leaving the restaurant, George Bush showed special interest to the Georgian artists.
George Bush not once recalled his visit to Tbilisi, delicious Georgian dishes and Georgian national dances. Once the US president told to Georgian president,
"I bicycle still trying to lose the 4 kilograms that I gained in Tbilisi." Mikhail Saakashvili joked and told George Bush that the US president was evidently gifted with the talent of dance. "You will dance Georgian dances much better than I do. You have demonstrated that you are very talented. You are a native of Texas, but I believe that you are a bit Georgian deep inside." Mikhail Saakashvili smiled at George Bush and asked whether the US president would prefer to come back to Georgia and to start career of a dancer. The US president smiled back and answered, "I'd better complete with my presidency. I believe that I managed to do it better so far."
all world rulers praised Georgia after their visits to the country. However, the British Premier Margaret Thatcher said something special about Georgians. After Margaret Thatcher was back in London from Tbilisi, journalists actively tried to clear the reasons and motivation of her visit to not as well-known country as Georgia was. Margaret Thatcher answered immediately.
She said that she wanted to look in the eyes of those people who never knew during the whole history of the country what hatred to anyone else meant.